This is the writing game, and I'm Gregory Palaci. Today, today we're going to do something different. We're not going to talk about writing or storytelling theories. No, we're going to get practical. Practical in this case is in how to sell your story to your team. Because until telepathy becomes a thing, you'll just have to interact with others to get them interested in your writing. So, why not have some props to help? And if all else fails, you can always rely on interpretive dance. Humanity's legacy of stories and storytelling is the most precious we have. All wisdom is in our stories and songs. At the very simplest, it can be he, she was born, lived, died. Probably that is a template of our stories. A beginning, a middle, and an end. This is the structure in our minds. Doris Lessing. So, you've got to sell your story, be it to a publisher, your lead, your team, or an investor, and you're not quite sure that they're going to understand your brilliance. Or they may want something a little more traditional in structure, form, or character, which is another way of saying a 3-act structure, the hero's journey, and a straight white dude. By the by, I'm disappointed that Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is about another young straight white dude. They could have done so much more with any other character, and had more themes, stories, and motivations available to them. That doesn't mean I won't play it, because I do like me some Star Wars. That aside, there are a number of tools you can use when conveying your story to the intended audience. Each has their strengths and weaknesses. And as with anything, you'll have to figure out what will work best with those you're speaking to. So, for this episode, we'll go through each of those tools, which include the elevator pitch, an outline, a synopsis, a story breakdown, storyboards, and references. The elevator pitch, you've heard the term and you're probably thinking it's saying something like, our game is X meets Y. That's not an elevator pitch. At best, it's an attempt to give your audience references for what you're making, but in fact tells them nothing. A hazard to call it dangerous since no one's in any actual danger, yet the trouble with saying X meets Y is that you don't know what aspects of either X or Y your audience has grasped. I'm currently working on a game, A Giant Problem. Yes, that's really its name. If I were to describe it as Breath of the Wild meets Tower Defense, what are your immediate thoughts? Is it the art style, or the focus on a single character? Breaking weapons, perhaps? The world of Hyrule? Do you even know what tower defense is? It tells you nothing when I say Breath of the Wild meets tower defense. A good elevator pitch, especially when it comes to talking about a story, sums it up in as few words as possible. Something like, and I made this up based on a real game, descend into an alien hell and fight your way out as a lone super soldier in a bid to save your crew, the universe, and yourself. Care to hazard a guess as to what game I'm talking about? If you said Halo Combat Evolved, you're right, and you win absolutely nothing. If you said anything else, you could also be right. Ultimately, some of the story arcs are going to repeat, or be so similar it's hard to tell them apart. Was I talking about Doom, or Duke Nukem, or Wolfenstein, or any number of other series? Probably. I say the elevator pitch needs to be a single sentence. Other people say it can be as many as needed, as long as you can say it all within 20 to 30 seconds, or an elevator ride. Personally, I prefer the constraints of a single sentence. It requires you to really analyze what the focus is and hone the story. This holds true whether you're talking about a character, a quest line, a story arc, a piece of lore, or an entire game, or a YouTube and podcast series. In this case, the elevator pitch for the writing game is a series about analyzing the theory and providing practical advice about designing stories. Hence, why I use the tagline, Designing Stories. Here's one final example of a great elevator pitch.
Hello. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
In those 4 lines, you learn everything you need to know. Who the characters are, what their relationships are, what their motivations are, and what's going to happen. And even with Mandy Patinkin stretching those lines out for dramatic effect, it all happens in 11 seconds. Perfect in a manner deserving a chef's kiss. So, you may find yourself needing to provide more detail than an elevator pitch to get your team on board with your story. That's why we have outlines. And I know what you're saying, but I don't outline. I write as it flows from the heart, from the seat of my pants, as inspiration strikes. You know what else comes from the seat of your pants? Farts. And no one wants those. Well, no one else wants those. Not outline is fine for solo work, generally of a novelist. But in game development, you're working as part of a team, and that means your team cannot wait for wit, whimsy, fancy, or flashes of inspiration to strike. And to be fair, novelists, as they go throughout their career, tend to end up outlining more and more in an effort to sell their future books. Your team needs you to be working as you work, which is why you need an outline. So, aside from the additional information about your story an outline provides, it also allows others to plan and make suggestions or provide feedback. Now, an outline can be as simple as a list of the chapters or levels, similar to what we see in Super Mario Bros. 3. The world map lays out the chapters we're going to encounter, or at least it provides a list for the player of how many stages they'll go through. For stories though, an outline is often different, and there's no set form. Even if you were taught how to outline an essay in school, you don't necessarily have to follow that. Personally, I tend to write outlines as a location and or scene because I know the story beats I want to hit during that section. But of course, anyone I'm working with doesn't, though giving them an outline does provide the bones of the story they'll be working with. Outlines, as with everything else about a game, can change during development. Hell, these days a game can change even once it's been published. So, don't feel like you're committing yourself to something you can never veer from. If the story takes you elsewhere, then it does, and you can update the outline to reflect that. Part of the beauty of this ability to change is you're not beholden to any particular story beat, as the outline is really just the major points in a story, no matter how big. The downside to this is it allows others the space to imagine something else entirely, filling those gaps between those milestones. Which brings us to the synopsis. If the outline is the bones of a story, then the synopsis includes the connective tissue. It builds on the outline to include the major details, such as characters, what they do, how they interact, and how the story develops. The most disappointing thing for many writers in creating a synopsis is that you have to give away the twists, and even the ending. You have to reveal that Darth Vader is really Luke's father, and that Spider-Man dies, and that Bruce Willis was dead the entire time. What you're not doing in the synopsis is actually writing all of those bits out. Instead, you're simply stating what happens. With book outlines, it's often in the present tense, and given the fact that games are interactive, I cannot think of a good reason to change this format. Writing in the present tense helps you as a writer or game designer to get a better idea of what the player should be doing and what their focus is. If we turn to Firewatch and the raccoon attack, then the synopsis would be something like Henry enters the burned down cottage. He goes to the old stove and opens it. A raccoon jumps out and Henry falls over. The raccoon then makes for the window and escapes while Henry recovers. There's no emotion, no gilding, no great detail there. And of course, that's just a synopsis for a single scene. In the context of the wider game, it may have just been reduced to a single sentence. Henry goes to a dilapidated cabin, opens a stove, only for a raccoon to jump out and surprise Henry. If we compare that synopsis to the actual scene, it includes nothing of the detail. That makes it a unique story or encounter. The synopsis doesn't list mechanics or sound effects, art assets, or even dialogue. It states simply what is to occur, leaving all of the nitty-gritty writing and further design work for later. The obvious downside to a synopsis is the amount of time it takes to produce, as even with an outline, your team may not understand or get what you're trying to do. So let's take a quick detour and talk about your team, or those you're trying to sell your story to. The fact is, you're not going to convince everyone, nor are you going to convince anyone all the time. People have different competing concepts and different abilities to imagine scenarios, scenes, or ideas. You can't account for all those possibilities. What you can do is use these tools to simplify and clarify for yourself. Then you'll be better able to present your case and argue it. Back to the tools, or really on with a new one. Storyboards. Storyboards are essentially comic strips that are quickly drawn and have minimal details that help tell and visualize a story. If you've watched a making of documentary for most movies, you'll probably see some storyboards. Some works like Mad Max Fury Road started as storyboards. It's only later that a script was written based upon them. That's not always the way to go, as was the case with Aliens 3. But it is an excellent way to convey the action of a story or scene. And for games, it's no different, especially when you're talking mechanics. But a storyboard takes an artist, or at least some level of skill, to convey your intent. I found storyboards to be quite useful, and to make sure I and any artists I'm working with are on the same page, I recommend Professional Storyboarding, Rules of Thumb, by Sergio Paez and Anson Ju. It provides a lot of examples of how to draw different scenes and the language used for talking about them. And if you have that shared terminology, it makes creating storyboards that much easier. There's, of course, an additional level you can take with the storyboard if you're so inclined, and that's the color script. Popularized by Pixar, it's essentially taking the storyboard and adding a color palette to it, all in order to demonstrate how the color changes over the course of a scene or story, and thus affects and reflects the moods or themes. It's also a great way of ensuring that things aren't being repeated too often and thus become boring. Of course, if you don't have an artist, the skill, or the time to create a storyboard or a color script, you can simply provide references. Though I wouldn't recommend just putting all of your images on a single poster if you're trying to present a story. Rather, tell that story with those images by putting them in an order that makes sense, so you can present it to someone and not have to talk them through it. Which brings us to the mother of all tools, the story map, or as I sometimes call it, the story breakdown tool. I don't have a good name for it, and I keep forgetting what others have called it. But it's a combination of all the previous tools in an easy-to-reference manner. It's been used by the likes of that game company to make Journey, the photo of which is courtesy of I Am Le Yeti. Even Cory Barlog, the creative director of God of War, uses a similar tool for mapping out the game. And I know Gregory Loudon from Convict Games does something similar. Even Brick Mags, when working on The Gardens Between, developed such a tool. All these maps or breakdown tools have a number of things in common. They include the major areas visited in the game, the characters, the events of each area, the mood or themes for each section, and more. The amount of detail you provide in the breakdown is up to you and your role. As you can see from my own work on A Giant Problem, as writer and game designer, I've picked and chosen what elements to use from others' tools. Like most of them, I've laid it out in a linear format, representing the campaign as played, the areas the player traverses, what new mechanics or skills they gain in those areas, and of course, the story beats. My expanded version includes reference photos, color scripts, and even elevation of the environments, all in an attempt to tie together the story, its arc, and the general game, as well as level design. And if you've listened to an episode before, then you've heard me mention the story grid. The actual grid, as defined in the book of the same name, does this very thing for novels. It gets you to plan out what happens in your story, so it's readily transferable to other storytelling mediums like games. If none of these tools are to your liking, or you don't find them helpful with your team, you can always prototype your story or game. I recommend using either Twine or Ink for game story prototyping, as both are relatively easy to learn and could even be implemented as part of the final game. If that doesn't work, then you can always just write the story and ask others to read it. But hopefully in elevator pitch, outline, synopsis, storyboard, color script, references, or story map will be of use. For now, thanks for taking part in this episode of The Writing Game. I'm Gregory Paleci. Everything I do can be found at gregorypaleci.com, and I can be reached there or on Twitter at OneGameDad if you want to talk writing, games, this show, or even working together. And if you like what I do and want to support it, then please consider contributing on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/OneGameDad. Or just tell people how much you enjoy my work and put it in front of them. The Writing Game is hosted by Third Culture Kids, which can be found at thirdculturekids.net. Please be sure to like and subscribe or rate and review this show on whatever platform you find it. I'll see you on the next episode.